So Rod, thanks for joining me here today. Do you want to just give us a quick introduction to yourself and to Nucleation Capital?
Thank you for inviting me. My name is Rod Adams. I've been interested in nuclear energy pretty much my whole life. Started my career in 1981 and have been looking at how smaller reactors can provide the power that's needed for many applications outside of just large-scale electricity production. And sometimes if you stand in the same place long enough, everybody else will come to where you're standing, particularly if it's the right place. So Nucleation Capital, we formed it in about 2018. Spent a lot of time figuring out how we're going to accumulate the financial resources we want to invest in advanced nuclear as part of the energy transition. Our thesis as a fund is that you can't do decarbonization and the energy transition without having nuclear as a tool, and particularly nuclear as a bigger tool than it already is. And since we've started investing 3 years ago, we believe that the rest of the world is really starting to come to where we are in recognition of the importance of nuclear.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been one of the biggest topics, at least for the Assay magazine, for the past couple of months, and I think it's definitely catching on. But we will get a little bit further into that later. Just a quick reminder to the audience, if you do have any questions at any point, just feel free to put your hand up and we can halt our Q&A and get to some of your questions if you have anything pressing to ask Rod. So Nucleation Capital is a non-traditional venture fund. So what does that mean? And how does it benefit investors?
Typically, venture capital is something that's done by very large investors, very high net worth individuals, institutions, pension funds. It's a type of capital, part of the capital stack, where you go after the ground floor. You want to get in on the ground level. You want to find people with really cool ideas, but a really great team before they are really big. And you invest in them early and grow with them. It's a long-term investment. And we believe, though, that there are lots of people outside of those major institutions, high net worth individuals, that are just as interested in getting on the ground floor. And fortunately, over the last few years, in the fintech world, financial technology world, there have been tools developed, capabilities developed to allow much smaller investors to get into something like venture capital. And the way we do this is there's a company called AngelList. And one of the tools AngelList developed is called a rolling fund. And it allows us to open the door to anybody who's accredited. And there's pretty straightforward SEC rules on who makes it to be accredited. You don't have to be rich to do it. You just have to have $1 million of investable assets. And these days of having our own pension funds, it doesn't take very long to get to where you accumulate that kind of investable resources. If you don't have that kind of investable resource, you're not going to have much of a retirement. So we have right now 70 limited partners who've invested their own capital in the belief that we are on the right track with nuclear, advanced nuclear as an important tool for the energy transition. And one more, the rest of the world is still not quite accepting or moving in the same direction. So with a minimum investment of about $20,000 invested over a period of 4 quarters, so $5,000 a quarter, our LPs get access to the kind of companies that we do really deep due diligence on. We look really hard to try to find who's going to be the winners out of the, probably about 5 dozen companies that are developing new nuclear technologies. And it's not all just reactor developers. It's people on the back end who've got really important ways to store, use nuclear fuel, and even permanently dispose of it. We have people on the front end that are looking at ways to upgrade uranium to be more useful in reactors through enrichment. And then, of course, we've got the developers in the middle who've got new technologies that make nuclear accessible and useful to a much wider range of customers.
So, a lot of world leaders have been pledging to kind of greatly grow their nuclear power. So, can you talk a bit about the role of next generation nuclear in current and future decarbonization?
Yeah, one of the things that you're pointing to is that in just the last year, there have been pledges and declarations by a large number of countries, some very important countries like France and the UK and the US and Japan, and 25 total, that said, we know that we need to decarbonize, we need to move to net zero, and that one of the ways we're going to do that is to triple current nuclear electricity generating capacity. Triple. Okay, that means moving from the equivalent of 12 million barrels of oil per day being produced by current generation reactors to a point where we're producing 36 million barrels of oil a day from nuclear energy by 2050. That's a big movement and a rate of building that we haven't seen since the 1970s, but we have seen it before. We have at one time been bringing on roughly 12 to 13 gigawatts of electrical production from nuclear each year. And we believe that we can get to that again. One of the ways we're going to do that is to implement the idea that nuclear is not just central station electricity production. It's, in some cases, remote generation in terms of a 1 to 5 megawatt generator that goes to a place, I don't know if anybody was in here, place like a Zimbabwe that has a very unstable grid, and the only real way to produce power in a place where you really need it, a remote mine, is through a generator. Right now, generators mean diesel generators requiring a continuous supply of fuel. Well, one of the companies that we've invested in has a nuclear generator, fission generator, that fits into a single shipping container, can be moved almost anywhere in the world on the back of a truck via an airplane, shipped and put on a site and run for 10 to 20 years without new fuel. Now, that kind of generator could be used in a far larger area. It doesn't have to be small. But then there's medium-sized generators that can produce enough electricity for a moderate-sized city by themselves, can supply a few 100,000 people in a small, building maybe that covers a couple of acres. Then, of course, there are large generators that are being produced today. We just in the U.S. completed the first new nuclear plants that we've done in 40 years. Now, the Vogtle expansion project has been, on many levels, a challenge. Took longer than expected. Instead of 7 years, it took 14 years from very start to finish. By the way, construction took 10 years. It didn't cost the $14 billion that was expected. It cost $35 billion because of the length of time it took. But that Vogtle project did get completed. It is generating electricity today, and the marginal cost of that electricity is very close to zero because, as I tell people, it's just as expensive to own a nuclear plant as it is to own and operate a nuclear plant at its full power. There really is no savings by operating at less than full power. So this kind of activity, this kind of new power source is going to make it possible to keep those batteries charged, even if you have a week-long lull in the wind, which is not uncommon, even if you have long days with no sun because it happens to be December, January, February, which back when I was in college, we called that the dark ages because it really is dark if you're in, the northern climates. So those are the kinds of things that we see as changing what's happening. The recognition, even among the party here in the U.S. that has traditionally been opposed to nuclear, the Democratic Party is the one that passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which not only has a specific clean energy tax credit or energy tax credit for existing plants, it puts nuclear in the same category as wind and solar for the clean energy tax credit, which is not due to expire until we get to a point where we're almost in net zero. So it's not a 10-year thing, it's a long-term credit for producing clean electricity and clean heat.
Can you talk a little bit more about some of these new technologies that are associated with these advanced reactors, and how do you see them impacting the market moving forward?
Yeah, one of the things that the advanced reactors are doing is the recognition that fission is like combustion in terms of it being a heat source. It's not just used to produce electricity. So some of the designers are designing their plants to focus on producing heat at a temperature that is useful for industrial processes. And because we've, for a long time, 4 decades, the world has been working on a fuel form that can withstand very high temperatures. And it's called TRISO. What it is they put the fuel into a tiny particle, about a half a millimeter in diameter, and then coat that fuel with 3 layers of graphite and silicon carbide. And that tiny particle looks a little like a poppy seed. It's about the size of a tip of a pencil. But that fuel can retain fission products without any outside help up to a temperature of about 1800 degrees Celsius. You combine those particles into various forms, either a prismatic form or a pebble. Pebbles are somewhere around the size of a billiard ball, and some of them are being produced more like a ping pong ball size. And there's advantages to going to smaller pebbles in terms of heat transfer. So these TRISO-based fuel reactors are going to look at producing initially temperatures in the range of 800 to 900 degrees Celsius, still giving a large margin to that 1800 degrees Celsius point where they start releasing fission products. And if the fuel retains fission products at this very high temperature, there's no way for radioactivity to get outside of the core. Yeah, the core itself, highly radioactive, but it's inside a shield and it's not hurting anybody. It's not impacting the environment. So that's one direction, is very high temperature fuels. Another is a fuel form that's called molten salt. And in this case, the whole notion of a meltdown doesn't happen because the system is designed to operate with fuel that is already in a liquid form. It's already molten. Okay, that is the design point. So a meltdown doesn't cause a release of fission products. All of the equipment, the pressure vessel, etc., is designed to operate with this fuel in a liquid form. Now, compared to the traditional water-cooled reactors, some of these reactors operate with coolant that is at a roughly atmospheric pressure. The only pressure really is the fact that there's a depth of the coolant. It's maybe 10 or 12 meters from the top to the bottom. So there is some pressure at the bottom, but it's very low pressure, which means that there is no driving force that pushes radioactive material out to the environment. If there happens to be some mechanical fault or failure or leak in a pipe, it doesn't go anywhere. It just leaks out a little bit. In the molten salt case, it leaks out and solidifies, because as soon as you start cooling this stuff down below the typical operating temperature, it turns back into a solid salt. One other path that's being more fully developed is a path that's been around for a long time. It's called liquid metal cooled reactors. The typical metal is sodium, and that's still on the table, and there's still a number of reactors that are being developed with sodium coolant. And again, sodium in a coolant form is unlike water. It doesn't need to be pressurized. It is liquid, and at the right temperature and right pressures or right conditions at atmospheric pressure. Now, there's a reactor that's under development with a sodium cooled metallic core nuclear system that is heating a molten salt heat storage system. And the molten salt heat storage system in this case is essentially the same kind of system as used in a solar thermal power plant, where you heat the salt. It holds the high heat content, not just temperature. It's heat. It's something you can take away some power and it just gradually cools down. But because it has a certain volume and a certain physical nature, you can take a lot of power away as it's gradually cooling down. And this combination of a liquid sodium reactor and a molten salt heat storage system gives the reactor flexibility. And this reactor is being developed by a company whose major investors are Bill Gates and Nathan Myhrvold from the high-tech world. And it is going to be built in Kemmerer, Wyoming, at a site where a coal plant used to be, or still is. The coal plant's scheduled to be shut down in the fairly near future. And so this plant is going to be able to go in, and the reactor will run steadily because, again, reactors have a very low marginal cost. They cost as much to own and operate as they do to own. So the reactor will run steadily and keep the molten salt ready to go. When there's a high demand for electricity, the power can go up to 500 megawatts. When there's no demand, it can go down to zero and and the molten salt is being reheated. So that's another pathway that is giving nuclear access to more markets, particularly in a world where there's a lot of grids where not only does the demand fluctuate, as it always has, but the other power sources fluctuate. The wind and solar do fluctuate. They aren't always there. And so the grid needs to have something that can respond the opposite direction. If the wind dies down, you have to have something that comes in. And this system of flexibility will be one that can come in. The other advantage that liquid metal coolant has is it allows for a higher utilization of the input uranium. And in some cases, people say, well, wait a minute, it means they'll use less uranium. But the other thing is it makes uranium a more valuable fuel source because more of it gets used, and that will cause people to recognize that they can do more with nuclear power than they could, which again goes to the Jevons paradox, which actually is good for material suppliers. It means that if you do things more efficiently, people want to do more of it.
Interesting. Do we have any questions on this kind of these technical details that Rod has been going over before we kind of change focus a bit? Just
question, more of a practical question. For the fund, it sounds like you're investing in a lot of technologies and you know a lot of technologies and you're talking about projects that they're being implemented in. So is the fund's thesis to, back a company that sells a bunch of reactors and get eventually be taken public or have an M&A exit? Or is it also that you could be involved in project finance cash flows that gets implemented in a project and is producing power and then streams out some of the returns? Are you trying to get more of a capital gains type thesis or cash flow?
We are a venture capital company, and typically venture capital returns are investing in the ground floor, getting the company to a point where it's valuable for either an acquirer or to go public, and then we will liquidate our assets at that time, typically. Now, there may be some cases where we will go to our investors and say, we believe this company has still another burst of growth potential, value potential for the next couple of years, and we'll keep that company for a little bit longer after that liquidation event. But most cases, we're going to sell our stakes at that point and go on. Now, we're very interested in project finance, and there's some companies that we're investing in where their business model is different. It's not to sell reactors. It's to build the most efficient reactors they can think of, the ones that are the easiest to maintain and to fuel, and they have the lowest cost of operation. And then they're going to sell electricity and heat. Okay. The typical business model in nuclear has been that the GE's, Westinghouse, B&W's, Areva, now EDF, their model was that you sell the reactor, sometimes at not even a good profit, but you make your profit by selling fuel and selling services for the next 60 years. You design things differently if that's your profit motive. So, yeah. So we are interested, although, by the way, also in project developers, because just like there is in wind and solar and other things, you need somebody who's got the skill set to find the sites, to get the power purchase agreements set, to get the grid connections, and all those things that come together to make a project work.
We have another question.
Hi, Rod. Thanks a lot. Are you a majority investor or a substantial minority investor? Do you require a board seat?
When we go in, we're still pretty small, so we're not. We don't have any board seats, and we've always been a follower. We haven't led any of the rounds so far. Our typical check size is around $500,000, and we have invested in a dozen companies so far, and we're investing in about 1 to 2 companies every quarter. So we don't do a board seat. We are getting ready to go to a more traditional funding round, because unlike 3 years ago, there are now companies that recognize that nuclear should be part of their process, particularly if they're a socially conscious investor, whether they're an ESG investor. Nuclear is now no longer on the prohibited list in some of those institutions. 3 years ago, almost everyone we talked to either had a committed anti-nuclear person in their value, in their decision chain, or they had somebody who was had a lot of history about financial losses from nuclear, because nuclear has had a lot of project failures over the years, a lot of cancellations after spending a lot of money. Or they had a list of prohibited investments. And along with pornography, cannabis, prostitution, tobacco, nuclear weapons, nuclear power is on that list.
So I thought we could look, we are running out of time. I thought we could just kind of look at what's happening here in the U.S. In terms of the Biden administration's sentiment towards next generation nuclear, any policy advances that you're seeing, and any potential impacts from the November election on this.
Yeah, first I'll go to the last question first. One of the greatest things about nuclear in the U.S. in the last 5 years is it's become a bipartisan support group. Everybody wants to do something to help nuclear, and they're even competing to help it more. There have been 6 pieces of legislation, and the most recent one passed the House of Representatives with a vote total of 450 to 13. Okay, and so those kind of things have been happening. One passed the Senate with 96 to 3, and I can tell you, I'll name the 3: Markey, Sanders, and what's that other woman from Massachusetts? Anyway, yeah. All 3 of those are committed anti-nukes, but they're way in the minority now. The Trump administration was very positive towards nuclear. The Biden administration has been really good to nuclear. I talked about the IRA. They just had a summit on May 29th, so just a few days ago, where they talked about how much they've done and how much they're planning to do to make it possible for nuclear to grow. They're encouraging the Army to go out and think about smaller reactors for bases that provide electricity when the grid's not available, and of course provide electricity all the time, because once they build the plant, it's low marginal cost in a run. But so that's important. They've also recognized that if they take what they learned from that first of a kind project at Vogtle and make sure that that's transmitted to the rest of the people that are interested in building large reactors, there's now a complete design. They've got a new task force that's going to bring in experts from the other major project developers, construction outside the highway construction, maybe football stadium constructors, people that know how to put projects together and take the lessons they learned from Vogtle and make those go forward. So I'm really encouraged by the political landscape here in the U.S. The landscape in Canada is just as good, in at least the provinces that matter. You know, the ones that have actually markets, they're the ones that are, you know. Well, you're there. You're in Ontario.
Well, I mean, it's certainly a really positive sentiment, and we are actually out of time, but hopefully Rod is able to stick around for some meetings or some catch-ups outside after this for the rest of the day. But Rod, I want to thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.